The gunshots echoed across the valley like thunder as Katherine Keller pressed her back against the weathered schoolhouse door, her heart pounding in her chest. It was supposed to be an ordinary day teaching the children of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1878, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats had changed everything. "Get back, children," Katherine whispered urgently, ushering the wide-eyed students away from the windows. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her simple blue calico dress, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. At 22, Katherine had been teaching in this one-room schoolhouse for just over a year, having arrived from Boston with dreams of adventure and purpose in the expanding Western territories. Through the dusty window, she could see them 5 rough-looking men on horseback, their faces partially obscured by bandanas, weapons glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. The Callahan gang. Everyone in the territory knew of them, ruthless outlaws who had robbed 3 banks in as many months, leaving bodies in their wake. "Miss Keller," young Emma Thompson's voice quavered. "Are they going to hurt us?" Katherine placed a reassuring hand on the 10-year-old's shoulder. "No, dear. Everything will be fine." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she would do anything to keep her 16 students calm. She had to think quickly. The sound of a lone horse approaching from the opposite direction caught her attention. Through the rear window, Katherine spotted a rider tall and broad-shouldered, moving with purpose. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, tethering his chestnut mare to a hitching post before advancing toward the schoolhouse. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of a well-worn hat, but Katherine could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. One of the older boys, 12-year-old Timothy Rogers, pressed his face against the glass. "Miss Keller." "It's Mr. Kane," Katherine's breath caught. "Kyle Kane." The name was spoken with equal parts admiration and fear throughout Silver Creek. A former Texas Ranger turned cattle rancher who'd settled on the outskirts of town about 6 months ago. He kept to himself mostly, but the few times Katherine had encountered him in town, she'd found herself both intrigued and intimidated by his quiet intensity. "Everyone away from the windows," she instructed, moving to the center of the room. "Sit at your desks and stay quiet." The children scrambled to obey as Katherine strained to hear what was happening outside. The Callahan gang had circled their horses around the front of the schoolhouse. "We know you're in there, schoolmarm," a gruff voice called out. "Send out the Henderson boy and nobody else gets hurt." Katherine felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as she glanced at Martin Henderson, a freckle-faced 11-year-old who had gone pale with fear. His father was the town banker who had refused to cooperate during the gang's last robbery attempt. "Message from his pa," the voice continued. "We're gonna teach him what happens when folks don't play nice with the Callahan brothers." Before Katherine could respond, another voice deep and steady cut through the tension. "You boys seem lost. The saloon's back in town." Kyle Kane stood at the corner of the schoolhouse, his stance casual but his right hand resting near the revolver at his hip. The sun glinted off his dark blonde hair as he removed his hat, holding it almost politely. "This don't concern you, Kane," spat the leader Jack Callahan himself, recognizable by the scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth. "We got business with the Henderson boy." "Funny thing about that," Kane replied, his voice deceptively conversational. "I've got business here too. Protecting every child in this schoolhouse." Katherine found herself drawn to the window again, watching as Kane stepped deliberately between the mounted outlaws and the schoolhouse door. His back was straight, his shoulders set with determination. 1 man against 5. Callahan laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet afternoon. Those odds don't favor you, Ranger. Former Ranger, Kane corrected. And I've faced worse. The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Catherine's mind raced. The nearest help was in town, a good 15-minute ride away. By the time anyone could arrive, it might be too late. Making a split-second decision, Katherine moved to her desk and retrieved the small derringer her father had insisted she bring west. She'd never fired it outside of the single lesson he'd given her before her departure, but the weight of it in her palm gave her courage. "Stay here," she whispered to the children. "Lock the door behind me." Before they could protest, Katherine slipped out the back door of the schoolhouse, circling around to approach from the side opposite Kane. Her heart threatened to beat out of her chest, but she kept moving, keeping close to the building for cover. 5 against 2 looks a bit better, she called out as she emerged, the small pistol held steadily in front of her. Kane's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't take them off the Outlaws. "Miss Keller, this isn't your fight. It's my schoolhouse, Mr. Kane. My students." Her voice was remarkably steady despite her fear. "That makes it my fight." A slow smile spread across Jack Callahan's face. "Well, ain't this touching? The schoolmarm's got sand." His eyes narrowed. "That pea-shooter won't do much good against us, lady." "Perhaps not," Katherine conceded. "But Sheriff Taylor and his deputies are already on their way. One of my students slipped out the back window when you first arrived." This, too, was a lie, but Katherine kept her expression confident. Doubt flickered across Callahan's features. He exchanged glances with his companions. Kane seized the moment of hesitation. "You've got about 10 minutes before this place is swarming with lawmen. Is one boy worth a hanging offense?" For a tense moment, Katherine thought Callahan might call their bluff. Then he spat on the ground. "This ain't over. Tell Henderson we'll be seeing him." With a jerk of his chin, he signaled to his men, and they wheeled their horses around. "We'll be back when you least expect it," Callahan shouted as they galloped away, dust billowing behind them. Katherine's hands began to shake as the adrenaline ebbed, the derringer suddenly heavy in her grip. Kane approached her slowly, as if afraid he might startle her. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said quietly, gently taking the gun from her trembling fingers. His touch was surprisingly warm. "Probably both," Katherine admitted, finding it difficult to meet his intense gaze. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly. "Quick thinking about the sheriff." "I only bought us time. They will come back." Kane nodded, his expression growing serious again. "Yes, they will." The schoolhouse door burst open as the children rushed out, surrounding Katherine with excited chatter and relieved tears. She knelt down, embracing as many as she could reach, while Kane stood watch, his eyes scanning the horizon where the Callahan gang had disappeared. As the initial excitement settled, Katherine noticed Kane quietly preparing to mount his horse. "Mr. Kane," she called, disentangling herself from the children. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." He settled his hat back on his head, regarding her with those penetrating eyes. "I was heading to town anyway, saw the dust kicked up by their horses." He paused. "You should cancel school for the next few days, Miss Keller, until the sheriff deals with them." "And if he doesn't?" Kane's expression hardened. "Then I will." With that, he swung into his saddle and tipped his hat. "I'll escort you and the children back to town." It wasn't an offer, but a statement of fact. As they made their way down the dusty road, Kane at the front, Katherine bringing up the rear, and 16 chattering children between them, Katherine couldn't help but study the man who had stood between danger and her students without hesitation. There was more to Kyle Kane than the stoic rancher the town whispered about. And despite the lingering fear from their encounter with the Callahan gang, Katherine found herself curious to discover what lay beneath his guarded exterior. The main street of Silver Creek buzzed with activity as the unusual procession arrived. Parents rushed forward, alerted by the first children who had spotted them approaching. Sheriff Daniel Taylor emerged from his office, his weathered face creasing with concern as Kane explained the situation in low, measured tones. "Damn Callahans," the sheriff muttered, running a hand over his graying mustache. "Been trying to catch those boys for months." He glanced at Katherine. "You all right, Miss Keller?" "I'm fine, Sheriff," she assured him, though her nerves were still raw. "But I'm worried about the children, especially Martin Henderson. I'll post deputies at the school and send word to the surrounding towns," Taylor promised. "And I'll have a talk with Harrison Henderson about getting his boy somewhere safe for a while." As the crowd dispersed, and the children were led away by their worried parents, Katherine found herself standing alone with Kane in front of the sheriff's office. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, highlighting the strong planes of his face. "You handled yourself well back there," he said, his deep voice almost gentle. Katherine tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear, suddenly self-conscious. "I was terrified." "Being brave isn't about not feeling fear. It's about what you do despite it." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, Katherine glimpsed something behind his carefully maintained reserve, respect, perhaps, and something warmer that made her heart beat faster. "Will you be all right getting home?" he asked. Katherine nodded, indicating the small boarding house at the end of the street where she rented a room. "It's not far." Kane seemed about to say something more when Harrison Henderson's voice rang out from behind them. "Miss Keller, Kane." The banker hurried toward them, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his young son clutched tightly to his side. "Sheriff Taylor just told me what happened. I can't thank you enough for protecting my boy." Martin looked up at Kane with undisguised hero worship. "Pa says you used to be a Texas Ranger, sir. Is that true?" A shadow passed over Kane's features. "A long time ago, son." Henderson's expression grew serious. "This is my fault. I refused to let them empty the bank vault last month, thought having armed guards would be enough to deter them." He shook his head. "Never imagined they'd go after my boy." "It's not your fault, Mr. Henderson," Katherine said firmly. "The blame lies solely with the Callahans. All the same, I've made a decision. I'm sending Martin and my wife to stay with her sister in Tucson until this is resolved." He looked at Kane. "Sheriff Taylor mentioned you might be willing to help track these outlaws down." Kane's jaw tightened. "I left that life behind." "I understand," Henderson said, though disappointment was evident in his voice. "Still, the bank is offering a substantial reward for their capture. If you change your mind." After the banker departed with his son, an uncomfortable silence fell between Katherine and Kane. "You're not really considering going after them, are you?" she finally asked. Kane's expression was unreadable. "Like I said, that life is behind me." "Then why did you step between them and the children today?" The question slipped out before Katherine could stop it. For a long moment, Kane said nothing, his gaze distant. Then, "Some instincts you can't unlearn." He tipped his hat to her. "Good evening, Miss Keller." Katherine watched him stride toward the livery stable, his broad shoulders set with a tension that hadn't been there before. She had a feeling there was far more to his story than the sparse details that circulated through town gossip. The next morning, Katherine arrived at the schoolhouse to find Sheriff Taylor waiting for her, along with 2 deputies. "We'll be keeping watch throughout the day," the sheriff explained. "But honestly, Miss Keller, I'd recommend suspending classes for now." Katherine shook her head firmly. "Education doesn't stop because of threats, Sheriff. Besides, not all parents can arrange childcare at short notice." Taylor looked like he wanted to argue but merely sighed. "Your choice, but we'll be close by." The school day passed in a haze of nervous energy. Despite Catherine's attempts to maintain normalcy, the children were distracted, jumping at every sound outside. By mid-afternoon, only 12 students remained, the others having been kept home by worried parents. As Katherine was preparing to dismiss the class, the thunder of approaching hooves sent a chill down her spine. She moved swiftly to the window, relief flooding through her when she recognized Kyle Kane riding toward the schoolhouse, not the Callahan gang. He dismounted quickly, exchanging words with the deputies before entering the schoolhouse. The children fell silent, all eyes fixed on the imposing figure in the doorway. "Mr. Kane," Katherine greeted him, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest. "Is everything all right?" His expression was grim. "The Callahans robbed the bank in Casa Grande yesterday, shot 2 people, they're heading back this way." Gasps and worried murmurs filled the room. Katherine raised her hands. "Children, please remain calm. Sheriff Taylor and his deputies are here to protect us." Kane's eyes met hers, conveying a message she understood immediately. The deputies might not be enough. "Class dismissed for today," Katherine announced. "Everyone gather your things quickly." As the children collected their belongings, Kane pulled Katherine aside. "I'm escorting you all back to town. The sheriff's organizing a posse, but he's short-handed. Most men are out on their ranches or working the mines." "The Callahans have grown bolder," Katherine observed, keeping her voice low to avoid alarming the students. Kane nodded. "They're desperate. A gang like that, once they start spilling blood, they don't usually stop." He hesitated. "I've decided to join the posse." Katherine felt a pang of worry. "I thought that life was behind you." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Some things are worth fighting for." Their eyes held for a moment, and Katherine found herself unable to look away from the intensity in his gaze. Then one of the children tugged at her skirt, breaking the spell. The journey back to town was tense, with Kane constantly scanning their surroundings and the deputies flanking the group. As they reached Silver Creek, parents rushed forward again, this time alerted by the sheriff about the potential threat. "School's canceled until further notice," Katherine announced to the assembled parents. "I'll arrange to provide lessons for the children to complete at home." As the crowd dispersed, Katherine found herself once again alone with Kane in front of the sheriff's office. This time, however, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. "Be careful," she said softly. "The Callahans won't hesitate to shoot." His expression softened slightly. "I've survived worse." "Have you?" The question was out before she could stop herself. Kane was silent for so long that Katherine thought he might not answer. Then, "I spent 5 years tracking the worst criminals in Texas. Lost good men, good friends." His voice grew distant. "The last gang I hunted, they didn't just rob banks, they destroyed entire families." "What happened to them?" Katherine asked gently. "I got all but one, the leader." His eyes darkened with remembered pain. "He got away, left me with this." Kane pulled aside his collar slightly, revealing a jagged scar that ran from his collarbone toward his shoulder. "Is that why you left the Rangers?" Kane shook his head. "I left because I realized I was becoming as ruthless as the men I hunted." He met her gaze directly. "I came here to find peace, Miss Keller, to be something other than a man who's good at violence." "You're more than that," Katherine said with conviction. "I saw how you were with the children today. They trust you." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. Before he could respond, Sheriff Taylor emerged from his office, adjusting his gun belt. "Kane, we're ready to ride." "Got 8 men total." Kane nodded, his expression closing off again as he stepped back. "Stay safe, Miss Keller." "You too," she whispered, watching as he joined the gathering posse. The next 3 days passed in an agony of waiting. Katherine occupied herself by visiting her students' homes, delivering lessons and offering reassurance to worried parents. Each night, she returned to her room at the boarding house and found herself standing at the window, scanning the darkened street for any sign of the posse's return. On the fourth morning, Katherine was helping Mrs. Thompson in the general store when a commotion outside drew their attention. Rushing to the door, they saw the posse riding slowly into town, dust-covered and weary. Katherine's eyes immediately sought out Kane, her heart clenching when she couldn't spot him among the returning men. Sheriff Taylor dismounted stiffly, his face grim as he approached the gathering crowd. "Did you find them?" someone called out. "Got 3 of them," Taylor announced. "Jack Callahan and his youngest brother are still out there." Katherine pushed her way forward. "Mr. Kane?" she asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "He's bringing in the prisoners. Should be along shortly." Relief washed over her, followed immediately by embarrassment at how transparent her concern must have been. She retreated back into the store, ignoring Mrs. Thompson's knowing smile. It was nearly sunset when Katherine spotted Kane riding down the main street, leading 2 horses with bound men slumped in their saddles. She watched from the boarding house porch as he delivered his prisoners to the jail, his movements betraying exhaustion. When he emerged from the sheriff's office, their eyes met across the distance. For a moment, neither moved. Then Kane started toward her, his stride purposeful despite his obvious fatigue. "You're hurt," Katherine said as he reached the porch steps, noticing the makeshift bandage around his left forearm. "It's nothing, just a graze." His voice was rough from dust and disuse. "Let me see." Without waiting for permission, she took his arm gently, examining the blood-stained cloth. "This needs proper cleaning. Come inside." To her surprise, he followed without protest. The boarding house was quiet, most residents still out for the evening meal. Katherine led him to the small parlor and motioned for him to sit while she fetched her medical supplies. "The sheriff said you captured 3 of them," she said as she carefully unwound the bandage, revealing an angry red furrow along his forearm. Kane winced slightly as she began cleaning the wound. "Would have had all 5 if not for a lucky shot that spooked our horses." "Still, 3 is better than none." Katherine worked methodically, her touch gentle but efficient. "What will happen to them? Trial in Tucson, then likely the gallows." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Katherine sensed the weariness behind it, and the others, Kane's expression hardened. "They're heading south toward the border, sheriffs telegraphing for reinforcements, but you don't think that will be enough," Katherine finished for him. "Jack Callahan's cornered now, makes him more dangerous." Kane's eyes met hers. "You should consider leaving town until this is over, Miss Keller." Katherine tied off the fresh bandage, her fingers lingering briefly on his warm skin. "This is my home now. I won't be driven away by fear." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn." "Determined," she corrected, returning his almost smile. "There's a difference." The charged moment was interrupted by Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner, entering the parlor with a tray. "Thought you both might want some coffee," she said, her eyes twinkling knowingly as she set down the tray. "My, but everyone's talking about how brave you were, Mr. Kane, going after those terrible outlaws." Kane shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "Just doing what needed doing, madam." "Well, it's much appreciated. I'll leave you 2 to your coffee." With a not-so-subtle wink at Katherine, Mrs. Holloway bustled out. "She'll have us engaged by morning," Katherine murmured, feeling heat rise to her cheeks as she poured the coffee. Kane accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly. Would that be so terrible? The question hung in the air between them, simple yet laden with possibility. Katherine found herself at a loss for words, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. "I should go," Kane said finally, setting down his half-finished coffee. "Dawn comes early, and I've promised the sheriff I'd help train some of the townsmen for defense, just in case." Katherine walked him to the door, acutely aware of his presence beside her. "Thank you again for everything you've done." He paused at the threshold, turning to face her. For a breathless moment, Katherine thought he might reach for her, but instead he merely nodded. "Good night, Miss Keller." "Katherine," she said impulsively. "Please call me Katherine." The corners of his mouth lifted in a genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the hard edges. "Katherine," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. "Good night, then, Katherine." As she watched him walk away, Katherine acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for the enigmatic former ranger who'd stepped between danger and her students without hesitation. A man haunted by his past, yet still capable of such courage and kindness. And judging by the way he'd looked at her tonight, perhaps she wasn't alone in these growing feelings. The next morning, Katherine was awakened by frantic knocking at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Holloway, her face pale with worry. "Sheriff's called a town meeting, right away," the older woman said breathlessly. "Something about the Callahans being spotted nearby." Dressing hurriedly, Katherine made her way to the town hall, which was already packed with anxious citizens. Sheriff Taylor stood at the front of the room, flanked by his deputies and Kyle Kane, whose serious expression sent a flutter of apprehension through her. "Folks, I'll get right to it," Taylor began once the murmuring died down. "We received word from a rancher that Jack Callahan and his brother were seen camping less than 10 miles from town. Based on their movements, we believe they're planning to free the prisoners we're holding." Frightened whispers rippled through the crowd. "Now, I've sent for reinforcements from Tucson, but they won't arrive until tomorrow at the earliest. In the meantime, we're organizing a defense of the town." The sheriff gestured to Kane. "Mr. Kane has experience with situations like this and has agreed to help coordinate our efforts." Kane stepped forward, his calm authority immediately commanding attention. "The jail is our most defensible position, but we need to be prepared for the possibility that the Callahans might try to draw us out or create a diversion." As he outlined the defense plan, Katherine couldn't help but admire the natural leadership he displayed. This was a man who had led others in dangerous situations before, who knew how to maintain calm in the face of fear. "What about the schoolhouse?" someone called out. "It's isolated." "Could be a target." Kane's eyes found Katherine in the crowd. "The school remains closed for now, but we'll post men there just in case." After the meeting, as people dispersed to their assigned positions, Katherine made her way to Kane's side. "You look like you haven't slept," she observed. The corner of his mouth quirked upward. "Sharp eyes, schoolteacher." "I'd like to help," she said firmly. Kane shook his head. "It's too dangerous." "I'm not suggesting I join the defense line," Katherine replied, undeterred, "but I have medical training. I can assist Dr. Wilson in preparing for potential injuries." Kane studied her for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but stay in town where it's safer." "I will." She hesitated, then added more softly, "Please be careful, Kyle." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the effect was immediate. His expression softened, and he stepped slightly closer. "I'll do my best." The day passed in tense preparation. Katherine helped Dr. Wilson organize his clinic, preparing bandages and setting up additional beds for potential casualties. From time to time, she glanced out the window, catching glimpses of Kyle as he moved about town, checking defenses and instructing the townsmen who had volunteered to help. As evening approached, Katherine found herself once again at the doctor's window, watching as the lengthening shadows stretched across the street. The town had taken on an eerie quietness, with most citizens sheltering in their homes and businesses closed early. "You care for him?" Katherine startled at Dr. Wilson's voice beside her. The elderly physician regarded her with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Is it that obvious?" she asked, not bothering to deny it. Wilson smiled. "Only to someone who's been watching people as long as I have." He patted her hand. "He's a good man, that one. Carries some heavy burdens, but good all the same." Before Katherine could respond, the distant crack of gunfire shattered the evening quiet. She rushed to the door, heart pounding as more shots followed in rapid succession. "It's coming from the south end of town, Doctor," Wilson said, grabbing his medical bag. "Near the jail." Katherine snatched up a basket of supplies. "I'm coming with you." "It's not safe," the doctor protested, but Katherine was already halfway out the door. They hurried toward the sound of gunfire, staying close to buildings for cover. As they neared the jail, Katherine could make out figures crouched behind barrels and crates, returning fire toward unseen assailants. Sheriff Taylor spotted them and hurried over, keeping low. "Doc, we've got 2 men hit. Nothing life-threatening, but they need attention." "Where's Kyle?" Katherine asked, scanning the defenders frantically. The sheriff's expression grew grim. Callahan and 3 others tried to rush the jail from different directions. Kane went after 2 who were circling around back. Fear clutched at Katherine's throat, but she forced herself to focus on helping the doctor tend to the wounded men. As she worked, applying pressure to a deputy's bleeding arm, the gunfire intensified, then abruptly slackened. "They're falling back," someone shouted. Katherine looked up to see several defenders advancing cautiously, weapons trained on retreating figures barely visible in the gathering dusk. Her relief was short-lived when she realized Kyle was still nowhere to be seen. "Sheriff!" A young deputy came running from behind the jail. "Kane's been hit." The world seemed to tilt beneath Katherine's feet. She barely registered Dr. Wilson's hand on her arm as they hurried toward the back of the building. There, propped against the wall, sat Kyle, one hand pressed to his side where dark blood seeped between his fingers. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said through gritted teeth as Katherine dropped to her knees beside him. "Let me be the judge of that," Dr. Wilson replied, gently moving Kyle's hand to examine the wound. "Bullet went clean through. You're lucky it didn't hit anything vital." Katherine helped the doctor clean and bandage the wound, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. Kyle watched her face throughout, his eyes never leaving hers. "The Callahans?" he asked Sheriff Taylor, who hovered nearby. "Got away, but not before we winged one of them." "They won't be back tonight, at least." Once the wound was dressed, Katherine and the doctor helped Kyle to his feet. He swayed slightly, leaning more heavily on Katherine than she suspected he would have liked to admit. "We need to get him somewhere he can rest," Dr. Wilson said. "The clinic's full with the other wounded." "My boarding house is closest," Katherine offered. Despite Kyle's protests that he could make it to his own cabin outside town, he was outvoted and soon found himself in Katherine's small sitting room, stretched out on her settee while she prepared a medicinal tea that Dr. Wilson had prescribed for pain. "You shouldn't be alone," she said, bringing him the steaming cup. "Not with Jack Callahan still out there." Kyle accepted the tea, his fingers brushing hers. "I've dealt with worse." "You don't have to face everything alone," Katherine said softly. "That's what I've been trying to tell you." Something in his expression changed, the carefully maintained barriers slipping to reveal a vulnerability that caught at her heart. "I've gotten used to it, being alone." Katherine sat beside him on the edge of the settee. "Perhaps it's time for that to change." Their eyes held, the moment stretching between them with unspoken possibilities. Then, slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, Kyle reached up to touch her cheek. His calloused fingertips were gentle against her skin, and Katherine leaned into the touch, her heart racing. "You deserve better than a broken-down former ranger," he murmured. "I think I'm quite capable of deciding what I deserve," Katherine replied, summoning her courage to place her hand over his. "And who?" The kiss, when it finally came, was gentle at first, tentative, questioning. But when Katherine responded, sliding her hand to the nape of his neck, it deepened into something more urgent, years of solitude and longing pouring into the connection between them. They broke apart at the sound of Mrs. Holloway clearing her throat from the doorway. The landlady's expression was a mixture of disapproval and poorly concealed delight. "I've made up the spare room for Mr. Kane," she announced. "Doctor's orders that he stay in town tonight, and I'll not have people talking about impropriety under my roof." Katherine felt her cheeks flame, but Kyle merely thanked Mrs. Holloway with perfect composure, though his eyes, when they returned to Katherine's, held a warmth that made her pulse quicken anew. Later, after Kyle had been settled in the spare room and the house had grown quiet, Katherine sat by her window, watching the stars emerge above the silhouettes of Silver Creek's buildings. Despite the danger that still loomed with the Callahans at large, she felt an unfamiliar sense of hope blossoming within her. She had come west, seeking purpose and adventure. What she hadn't expected to find was someone who made her feel both stronger and more vulnerable than she had ever been, a contradiction that, somehow, made perfect sense when she was with Kyle Kane. Morning arrived with news that reinforcements from Tucson would reach Silver Creek by midday. Katherine found Kyle already up and moving about despite Dr. Wilson's instructions to rest, his determination to help with the town's defenses overriding concerns about his injury. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met," she told him over breakfast, which Mrs. Holloway had insisted on serving them privately in Katherine's sitting room, her earlier disapproval apparently forgotten in light of the town's crisis. Kyle smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "I believe you called it determined yesterday." Their easy banter was interrupted by Sheriff Taylor's arrival, his expression grave. "The Callahans broke out their men," he announced without preamble. "Ambushed the deputy who was bringing them breakfast. No one's hurt bad, but they've got guns now." Kyle was immediately on his feet, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wound. "Any sign of where they're headed?" Taylor nodded grimly. "That's why I'm here. Tracker found signs they're moving toward the schoolhouse." Katherine's blood ran cold. "But why? The children aren't there." "Revenge," Kyle said quietly. "Jack Callahan doesn't take humiliation well. We stopped him from taking the Henderson boy, stopped him from freeing his men on his terms. Now he's looking to make a statement." "There's something else," Taylor added. "3 of the older boys, the Miller brothers and young Thompson, they've been meeting at the schoolhouse to practice for the shooting contest next month. They might be there now." Katherine was already reaching for her shawl. "We have to warn them." "I'll go," Kyle said firmly. "You stay here where it's safe." She fixed him with a determined look. "Those are my students. I'm coming with you." The argument that followed was brief but intense, ending only when Sheriff Taylor pointed out that they were wasting precious time. In the end, it was decided that Katherine would accompany them part of the way, staying with a deputy at a safe distance while Kyle, the sheriff, and the other deputies approached the schoolhouse. The ride out was tense, each of them scanning the landscape for signs of the Callahan gang. As they neared the schoolhouse, Taylor signaled for the group to halt behind a small rise that provided cover. "I can see movement inside," he murmured, peering through his field glass. "Looks like the boys are there, all right." Kyle took the glass, his expression hardening as he surveyed the scene. Callahan and his men are approaching from the east. They don't know we're here yet. A plan was quickly formulated. Taylor and his deputies would circle around to cut off the Callahan's escape route, while Kyle would approach the schoolhouse directly to warn the boys. "Stay here," Kyle told Katherine, his eyes intense as they held hers. "Promise me." She nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." He hesitated, then leaned in to press a swift, hard kiss to her lips before mounting his horse and setting off at a careful pace, keeping to the low ground to avoid being spotted. Katherine watched, her heart in her throat, as Kyle approached the schoolhouse. He was perhaps 50 yards away when shots suddenly rang out. The Callahans had spotted him. Kyle spurred his horse forward, racing for the schoolhouse as bullets kicked up dust around him. Unable to remain behind, Katherine urged her horse after the deputy who had been assigned to protect her, following at a distance as the situation rapidly deteriorated. The Callahans had reached the schoolhouse before Kyle, and now gunfire was being exchanged from multiple directions. Through the chaos, Katherine saw Kyle dismount and make a dash for the schoolhouse door, firing back at the outlaws who had taken positions around the building. He disappeared inside just as the deputy pulled Katherine behind a large boulder for cover. "The boys," she gasped, straining to see what was happening. "Are they all right?" "Can't tell from here," the deputy replied, keeping his rifle trained on the schoolhouse. The standoff continued for what seemed like eternity but was probably only minutes. Sheriff Taylor and his men had engaged the Callahans, the crossfire forcing the outlaws to seek better cover. Katherine could see Jack Callahan himself, recognizable by his scarred face, shouting orders to his men as they regrouped behind a wagon abandoned near the schoolhouse. Suddenly, the back door of the schoolhouse opened, and Kyle emerged with the 3 boys, urging them toward a small gully that offered protection from the gunfire. The youngest Miller boy stumbled, and Kyle scooped him up without breaking stride, sheltering the child with his body as they ran. Katherine's relief was short-lived. Jack Callahan had spotted the escaping group and was now focusing his fire in their direction. Without thinking, Katherine grabbed the deputy's spare revolver and broke cover, firing toward Callahan to distract him. Her shots went wide, but they achieved their purpose. Callahan turned his attention to her, giving Kyle and the boys the chance to reach safety. What she hadn't anticipated was Callahan's brother flanking her position, cutting off her retreat. "Well, ain't this interesting?" the younger Callahan drawled, training his gun on Katherine. "The schoolmarms come to join the party." Katherine froze, the revolver suddenly heavy in her hand. From the corner of her eye, she could see Kyle's horrified expression as he realized her danger. "Drop it," Callahan ordered. When Katherine hesitated, he cocked his pistol. "I said drop it or I'll put a bullet in you right now." Slowly, Katherine lowered the revolver to the ground. Callahan grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Jack," he called to his brother, "look what I found." Jack Callahan emerged from behind the wagon, a calculating look in his cold eyes as he approached. "The schoolmarm with a gun. Now that's something you don't see every day." Katherine lifted her chin, refusing to show fear despite her pounding heart. "You won't get away with this. The sheriff's men have you surrounded." "Maybe," Jack conceded with a shrug, "but we've still got time to settle some scores." His gaze shifted to where Kyle stood with the boys, pinned down by gunfire from the other Callahan men, starting with that meddling ex-ranger. Understanding dawned in Katherine's eyes. "This isn't about the bank robbery anymore, is it? This is personal." Jack's expression darkened. "Kane and I have history. Did he tell you about his ranger days? About the men he hunted down?" A cold knot formed in Katherine's stomach as pieces began to fall into place. "You're not just Jack Callahan," she said slowly. "You're Jackson Calloway, the one who got away." A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "So he did talk about me. I'm flattered." "He said you destroyed families," Katherine replied, her voice steady despite her fear. Calloway's expression twisted with rage. "And what about my family? My brother that he gunned down. My father who died in a Texas prison because of him." "Your family murdered innocent people," Katherine shot back, "including children." "Enough talk," Calloway snarled, grabbing Katherine's arm roughly. "You're coming with us. Kane," he shouted. "Show yourself or the schoolteacher dies right here." For a terrible moment, silence fell across the battleground. Then Kyle emerged from the gully, his hands raised, face grim with determination. "Let her go, Calloway," he called. "This is between you and me." Calloway's grip on Katherine's arm tightened painfully. "Throw down your gun and come forward. Alone." Kyle hesitated, then slowly placed his revolver on the ground and began walking toward them, his eyes never leaving Katherine's. "Don't do this," she pleaded, but Kyle continued his steady approach. "That's far enough," Calloway ordered when Kyle was about 20 feet away. "You know, I've dreamed about this moment for 5 years, ever since you put a bullet in my brother and left me for dead in that canyon." "You were selling guns to Comanches," Kyle replied evenly. "Using children as shields when we came for you. Business is business," Calloway shrugged. "And now I'm going to finish what I started." He shoved Katherine toward his brother and raised his pistol. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Calloway's finger tightened on the trigger, Katherine wrenched free from the younger Callahan's grip and threw herself forward with a desperate cry. Simultaneously, gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Sheriff Taylor and his men launched their assault. Katherine felt rather than saw Kyle tackle her to the ground, covering her body with his own as bullets whizzed overhead. When she opened her eyes, his face was inches from hers, his expression a mixture of fear and fierce protection. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, quickly checking her for injuries. "No, Katherine's words died in her throat as she saw Calloway rising behind Kyle, blood streaming from a wound in his shoulder but his gun still in hand. "Kyle, behind you." Kyle spun, reaching for a knife in his boot, but before Calloway could fire, a single shot rang out from the direction of the schoolhouse. Calloway staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face before he crumpled to the ground. Sheriff Taylor approached cautiously, his smoking gun still trained on the fallen outlaw. "It's over," he announced, checking for a pulse and finding none. "The rest have surrendered or fled." In the aftermath, as deputies rounded up the remaining gang members and Dr. Wilson tended to the few injuries sustained during the firefight, Katherine found herself sitting on the schoolhouse steps beside Kyle, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. "What you did was incredibly brave," he said quietly, "and incredibly foolish." Katherine leaned against him, exhaustion beginning to set in as the adrenaline faded. "I believe we've established that those qualities often go hand in hand." Kyle's chuckle rumbled through his chest. "That we have." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as parents arrived to collect their sons, relief and joy evident in tearful embraces. "He was right, you know," Katherine said finally. "Calloway, you never did tell me the full story about your ranger days." Kyle tensed slightly beside her. "It's not a pleasant tale." "I'm not asking for pleasant," she replied, turning to meet his gaze. "I'm asking for truth." He studied her face as if searching for something. Whatever he saw there must have reassured him, because he began to speak, his voice low and measured as he recounted the darkest days of his career, the hunt for the Calloway gang that had left him physically and emotionally scarred. The moment he'd realized he was becoming as ruthless as the men he pursued, and his decision to leave that life behind. After that last confrontation in the canyon when I thought both Callaways were dead, I turned in my badge, he concluded. Couldn't stand the man I saw in the mirror anymore. Katherine reached up to touch his face gently. I see a good man, one who's carried too heavy a burden for too long. Kyle caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. When I came to Silver Creek, I was just looking for a quiet place to start over. Wasn't expecting to find someone like you. Someone stubborn and foolish, she teased. Someone brave and kind, he corrected, his voice softening. Someone who makes me believe I might deserve a second chance after all. The kiss they shared then was tender, a promise of possibilities neither had dared hope for before this moment. As the sun began to set over Silver Creek, casting long shadows across the schoolyard where they had faced down danger together, Katherine and Kyle walked hand in hand toward town, each step bringing them closer to a future that suddenly seemed filled with hope. 2 weeks later, the schoolhouse reopened its doors. The bullet holes had been patched, the windows replaced, and fresh paint applied by volunteers from town. As Katherine welcomed her students back, she couldn't help but smile at the newest addition to the classroom, Kyle Kane seated at the back, whittling a small wooden horse while the children took turns reading aloud. He had taken to visiting regularly, ostensibly to help with repairs and to teach the older boys woodworking, but Katherine knew his presence served another purpose as well. After the Callahan incident, parents had been understandably nervous about sending their children back to the isolated schoolhouse. Kyle's steady presence provided reassurance that their children were safe. What had begun as a practical arrangement, however, had quickly evolved into something more. The children adored him, particularly the boys who hung on his every word during the special frontier skills lessons he'd begun offering after regular classes. Even the girls had warmed to him, giggling behind their hands when he brought Katherine wildflowers or stayed to help her grade papers. As the last student filed out that afternoon, Katherine closed her lesson book and turned to find Kyle watching her, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What?" she asked, smoothing her skirt self-consciously. "Just thinking how natural you look up there," he replied, gesturing to her desk at the front of the room. "Born to teach." Katherine felt warmth rise to her cheeks, even after 2 weeks of courting quite scandalously by Mrs. Holloway's standards. Though the landlady had become their staunchest supporter, she still wasn't entirely used to the way Kyle looked at her, as if she were something precious and remarkable. "Will you walk with me?" he asked, offering his arm as they left the schoolhouse. "There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, Katherine allowed him to lead her along a path that wound through a stand of cottonwoods toward the creek that gave the town its name. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. "I've been thinking," Kyle said as they walked, his tone carefully casual. "That cabin of mine is awfully far from town, makes it difficult to visit the school regularly." "It is rather remote," Katherine agreed, wondering where this conversation was heading. They emerged from the trees into a small clearing beside the creek. There, nestled against a gentle rise, stood the foundation and frame of a new house, small but sturdy, with windows that would catch both the morning and afternoon light. Katherine gasped softly. "Kyle, what is this?" He guided her closer, his expression a mixture of nervousness and hope. "I bought the land from Harrison Henderson. Been working on it whenever I'm not at the school or tending my cattle." "It's wonderful," Katherine said sincerely, imagining the house completed, curtains at the windows, perhaps a garden out front. Kyle took both her hands in his, turning her to face him. I know it's not much yet, but I was hoping. That is, I thought perhaps. He took a deep breath, seemingly gathering his courage. Katherine Keller, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Joy bubbled up within her, so intense it almost took her breath away. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Kyle, yes, I will marry you. The smile that broke across his face was radiant. He lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her around until they were both laughing breathlessly. When he set her down, his expression grew serious again, though happiness still shone in his eyes. I can't offer you much, he said. Just this land, my heart, and a promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of you. Katherine reached up to touch his face tenderly. That's more than enough. The kiss they shared sealed their commitment, sweet and full of promise. When they finally drew apart, Kyle reached into his pocket and produced a simple gold ring set with a small, sparkling diamond. It was my mother's, he explained as he slipped it onto Katherine's finger. My father gave it to her when they homesteaded in Texas. Said it was a promise that wherever they built their home, love would be its foundation. Katherine blinked back tears as she admired the ring, touched beyond words by the sentiment and the family history it represented. It's perfect, she whispered. They lingered by the creek until sunset, making plans for their future, the completion of the house. A small wedding in the spring, Katherine continuing to teach while Kyle expanded his cattle operation. Simple dreams, perhaps, compared to the grand ambitions that drove others westward. But they were dreams built on love and mutual respect, on courage tested by fire, and a shared vision of what life could be in this wild, beautiful land they both now called home. News of their engagement spread quickly through Silver Creek. Mrs. Holloway insisted on hosting an engagement dinner, which soon expanded to include half the town. Sheriff Taylor offered to give Katherine away in the absence of her father and doctor. Wilson proposed a toast to the schoolmarm and the ranger who faced down danger together and found love in the bargain. As spring blossomed across the Arizona territory, so too did the house by the creek take shape. Townspeople contributed labor and materials, transforming the simple structure into a proper home with a covered porch, brick chimney, and even glass windows ordered specially from Tucson. The wedding took place on a perfect May morning, with wildflowers decorating the small church and children from the school singing a song they had secretly rehearsed under Mrs. Thompson's direction. Katherine wore a dress of ivory satin that Mrs. Holloway and several other ladies had helped her make, with lace salvaged from her mother's wedding gown sent from Boston at her request. As Katherine walked down the aisle toward Kyle, who stood tall and handsome in a new suit, his eyes never leaving hers, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first confrontation at the schoolhouse to the final showdown with the Callahans, they had faced danger side by side, discovering in each other the strength, courage, and love that would form the foundation of their shared life. Dearly beloved, the minister began as Katherine took her place beside Kyle, their hands joining naturally, as if they had always belonged together. We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have demonstrated the true meaning of courage and devotion. 3 years later, Katherine stood on the porch of their creekside home, watching as Kyle rode in from checking the cattle, their 2-year-old son Thomas perched happily in front of him on the saddle. The sight never failed to warm her heart. Her husband, who had once been so solitary and burdened by his past, now laughing freely as he lifted their boy high in the air before setting him down to run toward her on sturdy little legs. "Mama, Mama, we saw baby cows," Thomas exclaimed, his blue eyes so like his father's wide with excitement. "Did you now?" Katherine knelt to embrace him, breathing in the scent of sunshine and hay that clung to his dark curls. "And were they as handsome as you?" "Handsome as Papa," the boy corrected seriously, making Kyle chuckle as he joined them on the porch. Katherine stood to receive her husband's kiss, lingering in his embrace a moment longer than usual. His arms tightened around her, sensing the emotion she was trying to contain. "Everything all right?" he murmured against her hair. She nodded, then pulled back slightly to meet his gaze, a smile blooming across her face. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it this morning. We're going to have another baby." Joy and wonder transformed Kyle's expression. "Katherine," he breathed, his hand moving gently to rest against her still flat stomach. "That's wonderful news." Thomas tugged at his father's pant leg. "What news, Papa?" Kyle scooped up their son, settling him on his hip. "The news is, young man, that you're going to be a big brother." As Thomas peppered them with questions about when the baby would arrive, and whether it would be a boy or girl, Katherine leaned against her husband, contentment washing over her. Their life wasn't always easy. The Arizona territory could be harsh and unforgiving, and building a successful ranch required long hours of hard work, but it was rich with love and purpose. The schoolhouse, where they had first faced danger together, still stood, though Katherine now taught only 3 days a week, with a young woman from Tucson handling the other 2. Kyle had established himself as one of the most respected ranchers in the county. His knowledge of the land and fair dealings with both settlers and the native Apache, earning him a reputation for integrity that had erased any lingering whispers about his ranger past. And their home, once just a dream sketched in the dirt beside a creek, had become a place of warmth and welcome, not just for them and their growing family, but for travelers, neighbors, and the occasional lost soul in need of kindness, and a fresh start, the same chance at redemption that Kyle himself had found in Silver Creek. That evening, after Thomas had been tucked into bed with stories of brave cowboys and clever schoolteachers, Katherine and Kyle sat on their porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk while cicadas sang their summer chorus. "You ever think about that day?" Kyle asked, his arm around her shoulders, fingers idly playing with a strand of her hair that had escaped its pins. "When the Callahans surrounded the schoolhouse," Katherine nodded, leaning into his warmth. "Sometimes. Mostly I think about how fortunate we were, how fortunate I was that you came along when you did." Kyle pressed a kiss to her temple. "I think it was me who was fortunate. If not for those outlaws, I might never have found the courage to speak to the beautiful schoolteacher who had caught my eye the very first time I saw her in town." "Is that so?" Katherine turned to face him, amusement dancing in her eyes. "And here I thought it was my bravery with that Derringer that won your heart." "That certainly didn't hurt," Kyle acknowledged with a grin, "but it was your kindness I fell in love with, the way you put yourself between danger and your students without hesitation. The way you saw past what I'd been to what I could be." Katherine touched his face gently, tracing the lines that sun and smiles had etched around his eyes over the years. "And I fell in love with your courage. Not just the physical bravery of facing down outlaws, but the courage it took to leave behind a life that was destroying you, to start again, to open your heart when it would have been easier to keep it closed." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the swing moving gently beneath them, until Kyle spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You know, when I was riding with Thomas today, showing him the new calves, I realized something. For all those years I spent hunting men like Cowboy, trying to bring them to justice, I never really understood what I was fighting for, not until that day at the schoolhouse." "What do you mean?" Katherine asked. "I mean that standing between those outlaws and the children standing between danger and you, I finally understood what matters most. Not vengeance or justice in the abstract, but protecting what's good and innocent, building something worth defending. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. A home, a family, a future. Katherine leaned up to kiss him, pouring all her love into the connection between them. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the space between. "I love you, Kyle Kane," she whispered. "Former ranger, reluctant hero, and the best man I've ever known." "And I love you, Katherine Kane," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Brave schoolteacher, stubborn woman, and the light that guides me home." As night settled fully over the Arizona territory, stars appearing like distant lanterns in the vast sky above, they remained on their porch, talking softly about names for the baby, plans for expanding the house, and dreams for the years to come. Different paths had brought them to Silver Creek, his seeking redemption, hers adventure, but together they had found something neither had expected. A love strong enough to face any danger, and a shared courage that had laid the foundation for a life filled with purpose, joy, and the promise of tomorrow.